Imagine stepping into a Japanese kitchen in the 1930s, a time when the world was shaking under the weight of economic depression, and scarcity wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a daily reality. The shelves are nearly bare, rice is rationed, and even the humblest vegetables must be stretched to feed an entire family. Yet amid these hardships, ingenuity flourished. The foods that graced these tables were not glamorous. They were not crafted for taste alone. They were survival, nutrition, and a quiet form of resistance against the relentless march of hunger. In cities and countryside alike, ordinary families turned to the land, the forests, and the byproducts of everyday cooking to create meals that would sustain them through lean months. Sweet potatoes, barley, wild herbs, and even acorns became more than humble ingredients. They became lifelines. Leftover soy pulp from tofu, discarded rice bran, and the leafy tops of vegetables that others might throw away were transformed into dishes that could fill bellies, warm hearts, and preserve dignity. These recipes were not just about feeding the body, they carried stories. Mothers and grandmothers labored over steaming pots, knowing that each meal was an act of care, hope, and resourcefulness. Children, sometimes unaware of the full extent of the deprivation, learned resilience in the simplest ways. A sticky rice ball with seaweed, a small sweet from a dried persimmon, or a bowl of smooth kudzu starch porridge. Every bite carried the weight of history, the texture of struggle, and a hint of creativity born of necessity. Today, many of these dishes have faded into memory, tucked away in family stories or preserved only in regional traditions. But they speak to a remarkable truth. Even in the hardest times, food can be a bridge between survival and culture, scarcity and ingenuity, hardship and hope. Number one, kudzu root starch porridge. If you were a child in Depression-era Japan, the taste of kudzu might bring back memories of both comfort and survival. It was a dish born not out of luxury but out of necessity, when cupboards were bare and every scrap of nourishment mattered. Kudzu, that creeping vine that spread through the countryside, was more than just a nuisance to farmers. Its roots contained a starchy powder that, when carefully extracted, could be transformed into a silky porridge. People had known for centuries that kudzu starch could soothe the stomach, ease fevers, and even provide warmth on bitter winter nights. But during the lean years of the 1930s and 40s, kudzu moved from being a folk remedy to becoming a lifeline. A spoonful of kudzu starch, dissolved in hot water and sweetened with a little sugar or honey if it could be spared, turned into a smooth, almost glassy porridge. It was filling enough to quiet hunger and gentle enough to serve to the sick or elderly. In households where rice was disappearing from the table, kudzu filled the void. Farmers would dig the roots by hand, wash and crush them, and patiently leach the starch out through repeated soaking and filtering. The process was laborious, but when finished, the white powder could keep for months, ready to be transformed into food whenever times grew desperate. Why did this matter so much? Because it was one of the rare foods that offered both sustenance and healing. Japan was not only struggling with economic depression, but also preparing for years of wartime scarcity. Hospitals and homes alike leaned on kudzu as a kind of survival tonic. Mothers fed it to children whose bellies ached from hunger, and weary laborers drank it at night as a substitute for the hearty dinners they no longer had. The emotional twist lies in what it represented. Imagine a child asking for rice, only to be handed a steaming bowl of translucent porridge, sweetened just barely, if at all. It wasn't a meal to celebrate, but one to endure. And yet, in that moment of endurance, families found strength. A dish that began as medicine became a symbol of persistence, thin, humble, but life-saving. Today, you can still find kudzu in Japanese shops sold as a health drink or winter comfort food. But back then, it wasn't a luxury or a trendy nod to tradition. It was survival. It carried people through years when food was scarce, reminding them that the land itself, even its wild roots, could still give something back. From the glassy warmth of kudzu, we move to another forgotten dish of resilience. Number 2, rice bran soup, nukajiru. If you were living in Japan during the Depression years, you quickly learned that nothing could be wasted. Even the outer husks of rice, the bran known as nuka, found their way to the dinner table. Nukajiru, or rice bran soup, was one of those dishes born directly from hardship, a recipe that stretched the meaning of food itself. Rice bran was never meant for people. For generations, it had been used as fertilizer for fields, feed for animals, or as a base for pickling vegetables. The wealthy polished rice until it gleamed white, discarding the bran as a byproduct. But when rice itself became scarce, families looked at piles of discarded nuka and realized they held something edible, even nourishing. To make nukajiru, women would gather rice bran from milling shops or scrape together what little came from their own stores of grain. The bran was roasted to cut its bitterness, then boiled into a cloudy broth. Sometimes chopped radish, miso, or wild greens were added if they could be spared, but often it was little more than hot bran water. The result was earthy, grainy, and far from the polished bowls of white rice that symbolized comfort in Japan. Yet in those hard years, it was enough to keep a family warm and alive. Why did it matter? Because nukajiru represented survival at its most resourceful. Japan in the 1930s and 40s faced food shortages not just from economic depression, but also from the strain of militarization. Rice imports slowed, farms struggled, and families in both the countryside and the cities had to improvise. Rice bran soup, once unthinkable as human food, became a staple. It offered fiber, a trace of vitamins, and, most importantly, the illusion of a meal when little else remained. There is an emotional sting to this story. Imagine a child sitting down at the family hearth expecting the familiar shine of rice, only to be served a bowl of brown, bitter soup made from what used to be thrown to animals. For some, it was a humiliation, a visible marker of poverty. For others, it was simply life. Yet in those thin, smoky bowls, people found the will to push through another day. The bitterness on their tongues carried the quiet reminder that survival itself was a form of dignity. Today, rice bran is valued again, used in health foods, pickling, and even touted for its nutrients. What was once the food of desperation has been rebranded as wholesome and rustic. But in Depression-era Japan, nukajiru was more than rustic. It was a bitter, filling lifeline. And from this broth of scraps, we turn to something brighter: pumpkin stew, kabocha nemono, where a humble squash managed to bring a touch of sweetness into the hardest of years. Number 3, pumpkin stew, kabocha nemono. In times of scarcity, sweetness was a luxury. That's why, during the Depression and the years of wartime rationing, kabocha nemono, pumpkin simmered in soy sauce, sugar, and broth, was more than just food. It was a small taste of comfort when the world felt unbearably lean. The Japanese pumpkin, or kabocha, had long been a seasonal staple. Farmers grew it easily, it stored well through the winter, and it was filling in a way that few vegetables could be. By the 1930s, when rice and wheat were restricted, kabocha rose from being an everyday side dish to becoming the centerpiece of survival cooking. Families would slice the pumpkin into thick wedges, drop them into a pot of water flavored with soy sauce or miso, and let the flesh simmer until tender. If sugar was available, a rare treasure by the late 1930s, it was added to highlight the pumpkin's natural sweetness. Why did this matter? Because kabocha nemono wasn't just food, it was sustenance with dignity. Unlike thin gruels or bitter bran soup, pumpkin stew gave the illusion of abundance. Its golden orange flesh filled bowls with color, a reminder of nature's generosity even in dark years. It was also nutritious, rich in vitamins A and C, essential for families who otherwise lacked fresh produce. For children especially, a serving of kabocha nemono meant both calories and comfort. The emotional twist lies in its dual role. For many households, this dish carried two faces: the taste of desperation, and the memory of warmth. Imagine a mother ladling out bowls in a one-room farmhouse, the steam rising into the chilly air. The pumpkin, cut into small pieces to make it last longer, was meant to feed 6 mouths instead of 3. For some children, the sweetness was a fleeting joy. For others, the thin broth and shrinking slices became a daily reminder of how little was left. Yet there is resilience in this story. Families learned to stretch pumpkin in creative ways, mashed into rice to bulk up portions, dried and preserved for later, or combined with other root vegetables to create hearty stews. Even when meat and fish were absent, kabocha no mo offered a sense of home. The flavor was familiar, the texture filling, and the warmth undeniable. Today, kabocha no mono is still a beloved dish in Japan, served at home-cooked meals and holiday gatherings. It's no longer tied to survival, but to nostalgia. A taste that once symbolized hardship has been transformed into comfort food, reminding modern eaters of the resilience their grandparents carried through the hardest years. From the sweetness of pumpkin, we move to something far humbler: fermented soy pulp patties. A dish where the byproduct of tofu making became a stand-in for meat in hungry households. Number 4, fermented soy pulp patties. If you grew up in a Japanese home during the 1930s or 40s, the word okara would have meant something very different than it does today. To modern cooks, it's a trendy health ingredient, fiber-rich, versatile, and sustainable. But back then, okara, the pulp left behind after pressing soybeans into tofu or soy milk, was survival food, and sometimes it was the only meat families could afford. The dish was called okara hambagu, soy pulp patties made to mimic Hamburg steak or croquettes. Housewives would take the leftover pulp, mix it with chopped vegetables, perhaps a bit of miso or flour to hold it together, and fry it into rounds. The result was filling, chewy, and, at least in shape, reminiscent of the meat cutlets that had become popular in Japan before the Depression. Why did this matter so much? Because meat was expensive, rare, and often out of reach for working-class families. As Japan's economy strained under the Great Depression and then the wartime rationing system, beef and pork all but vanished from ordinary kitchens. Yet the craving for something hearty, something that could be cut with a knife and eaten in thick bites, never disappeared. Okara hambagu filled that psychological gap. It wasn't beef, but in appearance and ritual, it gave families the illusion of eating like they once had. There's a bittersweet twist here. For many children, these patties became their only memory of meat. They grew up thinking the crumbly soy pulp discs on their plates were the same thing as the Hamburg steaks they saw in restaurants or advertisements. Only years later did they realize that what they ate was not meat at all, but scraps, the leftovers of leftovers. Yet in that moment, it didn't matter. It was warm, filling, and shared with family. The resourcefulness of okara hambagu also spoke to the ingenuity of Japanese households. Nothing could be wasted. Tofu makers often gave away the pulp for free or at a token price, since it was considered a byproduct. For struggling families, this meant protein-rich food without the burden of ration tickets. By fermenting or carefully cooking it, they could preserve it longer, stretch it further, and turn it into something resembling a main dish instead of a side. Today, okara has made a comeback as a sustainable superfood, praised for its health benefits and low waste. But in Depression-era Japan, it wasn't a fashionable choice. It was a necessity, a way to hold on to dignity in the kitchen when the cupboards were nearly empty. From the humble soy pulp patty, we move to another survival trick: turnip leaf pickles, kabu no hazuke, where even the discarded greens of a root vegetable were transformed into a vital source of flavor and nutrition. Number 5, turnip leaf pickles. When food was scarce in Depression-era Japan, nothing was thrown away, not even the leafy tops of humble turnips. What many wealthier households might have trimmed and discarded became a staple of survival. Kabu no hazuke, turnip leaf pickles. Turnips were one of the few vegetables that grew well in poor soil and harsh weather, making them a reliable crop during times of uncertainty. The root itself could be simmered, grated, or stewed, but the greens were often just as valuable. Instead of tossing them aside, families washed the leaves, salted them, and packed them into jars or barrels to ferment. Within a few days, the leaves transformed into crisp, salty pickles that provided both flavor and nutrition. Why did this matter? Because salt preserved greens offered more than taste. They brought vitamins and minerals into diets that were otherwise dangerously monotonous. Rice, barley, or thin soups might fill the stomach, but they lacked variety. A few pieces of pickled turnip greens on the side gave every meal a spark of flavor. More importantly, the lactic acid fermentation provided by pickling kept the leaves edible for weeks, sometimes months, ensuring families had greens long after the harvest season ended. The emotional twist lies in the symbolism of scraps. For a mother to set down a bowl of rice gruel with nothing but pickled turnip leaves on the side might have felt like admitting defeat. These were the parts of the plant nobody wanted, yet in those years they became treasures. Children might wrinkle their noses at the bitter, salty taste, but for adults it was a reminder of resilience. Even what once seemed worthless could be turned into nourishment. Pickles also carried a cultural weight in Japan. They were not just condiments, but memory keepers, foods tied to the rhythm of seasons and the art of preservation. In lean times, kabu no hazuke took on a greater role. Instead of being one of many side dishes, it sometimes became the only accompaniment to the main meal. Families relied on its sharp, tangy bite to make plain rice taste fuller, to help broth feel richer, and to give their meals just enough variety to keep going. Today, you can still find kabu no hazuke in traditional Japanese households and markets. They're no longer tied to survival, but to heritage. The bitter, salty crunch now reminds grandchildren of the frugality and creativity of their grandparents' kitchens, those who endured by refusing to waste even a single leaf. From these salted scraps, we move to another food of ingenuity. Wheat gluten blocks, funamono, where dried gluten became a mock meat for families who could no longer afford the real thing. Number 6, wheat gluten blocks, funamono. In the kitchens of Depression-era Japan, imagination often had to stand in for ingredients that simply didn't exist. Meat was scarce, rice was rationed, and families had to make do. One remarkable invention of necessity was fu, or wheat gluten, a spongy, chewy block that could be simmered, stewed, or fried to mimic the texture of meat. When cooked in savory broth, it became fu no namono, a humble dish that sustained countless households through lean years. Wheat gluten itself had a long history in Japan, originally used in Buddhist vegetarian cuisine as a meat substitute. But during the 1930s and 40s, its role shifted from spiritual practice to survival strategy. Housewives would purchase dry blocks of fu or make it at home by washing wheat flour dough until only the gluten remained. The blocks, once softened in water, absorbed flavors like a sponge. Simmered in soy sauce, mirin, and broth with a few scraps of root vegetables, fu no namono became a filling main dish, stretching whatever little protein a family had across several meals. Why did this matter? Because texture can trick the mind. For children and adults accustomed to small portions of meat, fu offered familiarity. Its spongy consistency was chewy, its appearance vaguely steak-like, and its ability to soak up flavor made it feel hearty. In a time when nutrition was scarce, food delivered not only sustenance but a psychological comfort, the illusion of a proper meal in an era when proper was hard to come by. The emotional twist is subtle but powerful. Imagine a family gathered around a low table, the steam rising from a pot of brown broth, vegetables bobbing alongside pale, chewy blocks of fu. There was no fat, no marbling, no sizzle from a frying pan, but there was togetherness. The dish reminded them that even in scarcity, care could transform meager ingredients into something nourishing. It was a quiet defiance of hunger and deprivation. In addition to survival, fu no mono reflected Japanese ingenuity. Housewives learned to cut it into thin slices, shape it into faux cutlets, or layer it with vegetables to create a stew that felt rich despite its humble ingredients. The same blocks that had once served temple kitchens became the backbone of common households, showing that necessity could inspire culinary creativity as well as resilience. Today, fu is celebrated in traditional and vegan cooking, valued for its versatility and history. But in Depression era Japan, it was nothing short of a hero. In its bland, spongy simplicity, it fed the hungry, comforted the anxious, and reminded families that even the most modest ingredients could sustain life. From the spongy blocks of fu, we now turn to another everyday survival food, dried persimmons, hoshigaki, whose sweetness was preserved for months to bring a small taste of joy into harsh years. Number 7. Dried persimmons. In the harsh winters of Depression-era Japan, sweetness was rare. Fresh fruit was a luxury few could afford, and candy was virtually non-existent for struggling families. Yet in this scarcity, one small orange fruit became a beacon of warmth and comfort, the persimmon. Dried persimmons, or hoshigaki, were more than just snacks. They were tiny packets of survival and joy. Persimmons were harvested in autumn, their flesh firm and bright. Families would peel the fruit, tie them individually with string, and hang them outside to dry in the crisp air. Over weeks, the fruit would shrink and harden, developing a rich, concentrated sweetness and a powdery natural coating of sugar on its skin. The labor was meticulous, requiring patience and care, but the result was a fruit that could be preserved for months. Even in the coldest winter, when fields lay barren and the cupboards were bare, hoshigaki provided a taste of abundance. Why did this matter? Because it was not just sustenance, it was morale. In households where every meal had been stretched to its limit, a dried persimmon was a gift. Children would nibble on it slowly, savoring the sweetness that reminded them of better days, while parents might hide theirs to make the treat last. The fruit offered calories, fiber, and a rare flavor, all in one small, portable package. It was survival, yes, but it was also hope in edible form. The emotional twist is in the care it took to create. Each persimmon required hands to peel, tie, and turn daily. Families who might have been scraping to survive devoted hours to a process that yielded no immediate sustenance. Yet, the act itself became a ritual of resilience. Hanging fruit from the eaves, watching it slowly change through wind and sun, offered a small measure of control over an otherwise unpredictable world. In hoshigaki, effort, patience, and hope were all preserved alongside flavor. Dried persimmons also connected generations. Grandparents who had tended orchards taught children the art of peeling and drying. Recipes, techniques, and the joy of the final sweet treat were passed down orally, embedding a cultural and familial memory into every fruit. Even in the bleakest years, hoshigaki was a bridge between seasons, between childhood and adulthood, and between scarcity and sweetness. Today, hoshigaki remains a cherished delicacy, often featured in traditional Japanese New Year celebrations. But during the Depression era, it was far more than a seasonal treat. It was a small, enduring comfort, a reminder that even in deprivation, life could still offer moments of joy. From the preserved sweetness of persimmons, we move to another humble, protein-rich survival food, seaweed rice balls, wakame egiri, portable meals that nourished workers, students, and families alike when fresh ingredients were scarce. Number 8. Seaweed rice balls. In Depression-era Japan, the simple act of holding a meal in your hands could make all the difference. For families struggling with rationed rice and scarce ingredients, wakame onigiri, rice balls mixed or wrapped with seaweed, became a portable, practical, and surprisingly comforting way to eat. Rice was precious, often rationed to the point where it could barely fill a bowl. But by combining it with wakame, a type of edible seaweed abundant along Japan's coasts, Families could stretch their supplies while adding flavor, texture, and nutrition. The seaweed provided minerals like iodine and calcium, vital nutrients missing from diets that relied heavily on thin gruel or barley fillers. Mothers would mix chopped, rehydrated wakame into small portions of rice, shape them into compact triangles or rounds, and sometimes wrap them in larger sheets of dried seaweed to preserve them for later. Why did this matter? Because these rice balls were more than sustenance. They were convenience and hope bundled into a handheld meal. Workers heading to the fields, children walking to school, or families traveling between towns could carry nourishment without worrying it would spoil. Wakame onigiri offered a sense of fullness in a time when empty stomachs were common, and the salty, umami-rich flavor made each bite satisfying in a way plain rice could not. The emotional twist is in the simplicity. Imagine a child clutching a triangle of rice, feeling its warmth against their palms. The taste was familiar, the aroma comforting, and yet each bite was also a reminder of scarcity. These small meals were never indulgent, but they were practical, resourceful, and deeply human. They represented a way to make a little stretch a long way, to transform meager ingredients into something that could nourish both body and spirit. The ingenuity extended to preservation. By shaping the rice tightly and using the seaweed as a protective layer, families ensured the rice balls could survive hours without refrigeration. In cities and countryside alike, wakame onigiri became an essential part of the Depression-era diet. It was a food born of necessity, but also of cultural resilience, connecting back to centuries of Japanese tradition where rice balls were both sustenance and portable comfort. Today, onigiri remain a staple in Japanese convenience stores and homes, often filled with salmon, pickles, or modern flavors. But in the lean years of the 1930s and 40s, the humble seaweed rice ball was a quiet hero, a simple, nourishing, and portable reminder that ingenuity and care could turn scarcity into survival. From the handheld nutrition of wakame onigiri, we move to acorn flour cakes, dongri mochi, where even the bitterest of wild ingredients was transformed into something edible, filling, and surprisingly sustaining. Number 9. Acorn flour cakes, dongri mochi. When every grain counted, Japanese families turned to the forest for sustenance. Among the most surprising of Depression-era survival foods were donguri mochi, cakes made from acorn flour. Once considered a bitter nuisance for most, acorns became a vital ingredient when rice, wheat, and other staples ran scarce. Acorns were plentiful in Japan's wooded hills, but they weren't edible straight from the tree. They were bitter, loaded with tannins, and required careful processing. Families would shell the acorns, grind them into a coarse flour, and leach the bitterness by soaking or boiling repeatedly. After this labor-intensive preparation, the flour could be mixed with water, a bit of sugar if available, and sometimes rice flour, then shaped into small cakes or patties. The result was earthy, slightly sweet, and filling, a far cry from the polished treats of better times, yet nourishing enough to keep hunger at bay. Why did this matter? Because acorn cakes represented both ingenuity and endurance. In rural areas where rice was rationed or unavailable, these cakes filled bellies and provided a rare source of carbohydrates. Children and adults alike ate them as a snack, breakfast, or even a main meal, often alongside thin soups or pickled vegetables. The forest, once just a backdrop to daily life, became a pantry of last resort. The emotional twist comes from the labor and transformation. What began as a bitter, nearly inedible nut required patience, skill, and persistence. Mothers and grandmothers spent hours soaking and grinding, turning what could have been a curse into something sustaining. Imagine the satisfaction of biting into a small, warm donguri mochi, knowing that the effort of hours had been transformed into life itself. These cakes were a reminder that even the harshest, most unyielding parts of nature could be made into sustenance when necessity demanded it. Donguri mochi also carried cultural significance. Acorns had been part of traditional Japanese diets for centuries, though usually in times of famine or in rural regions. In the Depression era, these cakes became a bridge between past and present, connecting younger generations with the survival strategies of their grandparents. They embodied resilience, patience, and resourcefulness, qualities that defined daily life in hard times. Today, acorn flour is sometimes used in artisanal flours or specialty foods, a novelty rather than a necessity. But in the lean years of Depression era Japan, donguri mochi was far more than that. It was survival, ingenuity, and quiet nourishment wrapped into one simple, earthy cake. From the earthy sustenance of acorns, we now turn to another overlooked survival food, grasshopper tsukudani, inago no tsukudani, where even insects became a vital protein source in difficult times. Number 10, lotus root stir fry, renkenpira. In the kitchens of Depression-era Japan, a crunchy root could make the difference between a dull meal and one that felt nourishing. Renkan kimpira, or lotus root stir fry, was one of those dishes that transformed simple, inexpensive ingredients into something both hearty and satisfying. Lotus root, with its pale, knobby slices and naturally sweet, earthy flavor, was affordable and readily available, even when more desirable vegetables were scarce. Families would slice the root thinly, then saute it in a small amount of oil or simmer it with soy sauce, mirin, and sugar. Often, sesame seeds or chili flakes were added if available, giving the dish aroma and a subtle kick. Its firm texture and intricate lace-like holes created a sense of substance, every bite crunchy, filling, and oddly comforting in lean times. Why did this matter? Because Renkan Kimpira offered both nutrition and psychological comfort. In an era when meat, fish, and fresh vegetables were limited, this root could be stored for weeks, cooked quickly, and combined with grains to stretch meals further. Its starchiness satisfied hunger, while its flavor added a small but meaningful sense of richness to otherwise thin, repetitive diets. The dish also reminded families of familiar flavors and textures, keeping a connection to home even when the world felt unsettled. The emotional twist lies in its symbolism of resilience. Imagine a mother carefully slicing lotus root in the dim light of a small kitchen, preparing enough for a family who hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. Each slice was modest, yet together they created a dish that brought warmth and sustenance. In a time of scarcity, a humble root could feel like a luxury, and the act of cooking it became an assertion of care, creativity, and survival. Lotus root also carries cultural resonance. It is often associated with good fortune in Japan, the holes symbolizing a clear path through obstacles. In Depression-era kitchens, this symbolism may have been subconscious, but in practice, the root provided both literal and figurative nourishment. Renkan Kimpira was affordable, adaptable, and resilient, just like the families who relied on it to make ends meet. Today, lotus root stir fry remains a classic side dish, valued for its crunch and versatility. But in the 1930s and 40s, it was more than a delicacy. It was survival on a plate, a quiet reminder that even the simplest ingredients prepared with care could sustain body and spirit during the hardest of times. From the crunchy, earthy lotus root, we now move to burdock root soup, where another humble root became a vital source of sustenance flavor in households struggling. Conclusion, reflection, and emotional close. As we step back from these kitchens of the past, a pattern emerges. These are not just recipes, they are stories of human resilience, resourcefulness, and ingenuity. Every bowl of rice bran soup, every slice of lotus root, every dried persimmon carried the weight of necessity, yet also a spark of creativity. They remind us that survival is not just about calories. It's about transforming what little we have into something meaningful, sustaining, and even comforting. What stands out most is the quiet dignity in these meals. They were never flashy, they were never indulgent, yet in their simplicity they nourished both body and spirit. A child's sticky hands on a seaweed rice ball, the slow peeling of acorns, the patient drying of persimmons. Each act was a small rebellion against scarcity, a testament to endurance, and a reminder of the power of care in even the harshest circumstances. Today, these recipes might seem quaint, even exotic. Some have become seasonal treats or health foods celebrated for their flavor and tradition. But in their origin, they were survival. They were the embodiment of families refusing to let hardship defeat them, of a culture turning scarcity into sustenance, of ordinary people using ingenuity, patience, and creativity to endure. Remembering these dishes is more than nostalgia. It is a lesson in resilience, a window into history, and a tribute to those who, in the face of scarcity, fed not just the body, but the spirit. As we reflect on these forgotten recipes, we are reminded that sometimes survival is not just about what we eat, it's about the care, creativity, and perseverance that goes into every meal. And through these foods, we can taste in the simplest and most profound way the enduring spirit of Depression era Japan. If you want, I can also craft a clickable, curiosity driven hook line for the very start of